Hello, and welcome to the DT Max Session of Synergy 2023. My name is Gerry DT, head trainer at DT Tax and Accounting, and I will present to you today some features of DT Max. Specifically, what we're going to look at in the session, we're going to start with two new features of the program that will be added to tax year 2023. The first is the tax review checklist, which will be a new feature in the data entry, allowing you to log answers to specific questions that you would have during the production process of your customer's tax return. From there, we're going to look at a new tool being added, which is the Client Letter Assistant, which is a new tool that will allow you to quickly and easily edit the client letter templates offered within DT Max. From there, we're going to look at recent DT Max productivity features, so recent improvements that we made to DT Max, just to remind you of those features in order to better utilize them in the future. And then finally, we're going to give you a preview course that is found within the Learning Center portal. So within Synergy 2023, you will have a course that will show you what the Learning Center portal is. So within this DT Max session, we're going to give you a preview of some of the courses that we offer within the Learning Center. So let's get started. Let's start with a tax review checklist, which will be a new feature that will be added to DT Max data entry for tax year 2023. So a tax review checklist, very simply put, will be a keyword group that will allow you to log answers to specific questions that you have on your customer's tax return during the production process. As you are producing your customer's return, you will have questions along the way that you will need answers to. What the tax review checklist will allow you to do is to record the answers to the specific questions that you have on your customer's tax return. So let's have a look at this keyword group. So in order to enter the keyword group, you simply click on the key with a plus sign or F11 as a shortcut key on your keyboard, which is the manual entry feature of adding keywords in DT Max. And I simply type in tax review in one word. Once I click OK, the program will simply add that new keyword group. Now, the keyword group is found in the accountant section of the Smart Start client profile. Now from here, I have the option of choosing the taxpayer. So in other words, these are questions that are for the taxpayer that I'm in right now, or for their spouse, or for any other member of the family. In this case, it would be dependents. So in our example, we'll make it simple and we'll do it for the taxpayer. And let's say right now, hypothetically, we are in the 2023 tax season, which means that we are inputting these questions or asking these questions in the calendar year 2024. And let's say that we are in the middle of the month of February, we'll say 24th of February. So I input the date in which I create this keyword group and I start asking the questions to my clients. Now, the questions that are found within this checklist are categorized into example, very broad questions or general questions on the tax return. Let's go to the general keyword here and see some example questions that the checklist is asking. Here you got RSP. Did your customer make any RSP contributions in the first 60 days of the year? Did they make any donations during the year? Did they sell their principal residence, etc., etc.? They go from these type of general questions to very specific questions on specific areas of the tax return. For example, you will have questions on employment expenses. You will have questions on rental income. You will have questions on business income as well. So it's quite broad and quite vast. The questionnaire will cover the majority of situations or questions you might have to pose to your client. So let's try a couple of examples to see this tax review checklist at work. So I'm in my production process here, and I've already entered most of the tax information of my client. And I notice as I'm looking at the right-hand side display, comparing the current tax year with the previous tax year. So I'm in 2023 right now, and I'm comparing with 2022 on my right-hand side display, I noticed that there was a contribution in the first 60 days of 2023. So that is a question that I want to ask now my client. Did my client make any contributions in the first 60 days of 2024? So I will go ahead and ask that question to my client, but I will also log the question through my tax review checklist. So let's go back to my tax review checklist at the top of my screen here, and under the general questions, I will choose RSP contributions for the first 60 days of 2024. I will choose that question, and I will simply ask my client, did you make any contributions in the first 60 days? As of right now, I don't have the answer to the question. So under the answer keyword, I will simply leave it at the question mark. Okay, I don't have the answer yet. I will ask the question to my client and get the answer afterwards. So I will simply click on the question mark, and at that point, I will await the answer of my client in order to, first of all, enter any RSP contribution my client did make in the first 60 days of 2024, and also to resolve the question within my tax review checklist. Remember that the checklist is used to log all the answers to these questions. You have essentially a paper trail to the answers to the questions that you are asking along the way during your production cycle. Let's try another example of a question that we can log, in this case, in our tax review checklist. Let's say my client has given me a different mailing address this year as compared to last year. I know that my client was renting the previous property. Maybe they purchased a new property. Are they considered a first-time home buyer? Well, let's find out. But first, let's catalog the question. Let's log the question within our tax review checklist in order, again, to have a paper trail to the answer that my client will provide me. So I go back to my general keyword over here. I choose the question first-time home buyer. I will choose that question. In my question detail, I can say new address. Did you purchase this home? I enter the question, and again, the question is going to be pending. I have not gotten the answer yet from my client to this question, so I will leave it at the question mark. And now I have logged this question that I need an answer to for my client in order to properly complete their tax return. So as mentioned, the tax review checklist is a means by which you record questions and answers that you have that pertain to your customer's return. So this record is, in the first place, entered in the data entry, and you have a record of it directly in the data entry, as you see here with the keywords that I used under the tax review for keyword group. But it's not the only place that the program will log these question and answers. The other place that the program will log them is in the tax return screen itself. So when you click on the tax return tab, you will notice a new form in the left-hand menu, which is called tax review questions. And within that form, you will see all the questions that you have asked for your clients that you have recorded within this new keyword group or feature. Now from here, you can choose to simply save this form as a PDF and submit it to your client and have them answer those questions directly and submit them back to you. Or you could simply keep this form as an internal log in order to properly log the answers that you will get from your customers later on. We've seen how we log the questions within this tax review checklist. Now let's have a look at how we log the answers that our customers provide us to those questions. So let's take an example here, and let's say my client has responded to the question of the first-time home buyer. We'll say, as a hypothetical, that they're still looking for receipts for the first 60 days. They don't have the answer yet, but in this case, they've replied in an affirmative for the first-time home buyer that yes, they did purchase a home in this case, hence the change of address. Now, the other answer in this case would be, well, are they a first-time home buyer? And the answer is, again, yes. Let's say as a hypothetical, the customer did not own a home in which they lived in the last 4 years. So now let's record the answer to that question that we've logged in the tax review checklist. So we'll go back to the data entry, and now we will expand the question that we asked originally. So here in Q General, first-time home buyer, originally we had just put a question mark in this case because we didn't have the answer right away. So we simply left it as a question mark. It was a pending question. Now we have an affirmative. The customer has confirmed that they did purchase their first home in this case. I will say yes. Now, answer amount for this question is not relevant in our example for the simple reason that the only reason we're asking for first-time home buyer is to claim the non-refundable tax credit. So in this case, we can simply leave it blank. The answer date, we provide the date they provided the answer to the question, and then the explanation, we will say, purchase of a first home meets the criteria. So now we're confirming, we're writing in, and we're logging the fact that A, my customer did purchase a home, and B, they meet the criteria for a first-time home buyer because they did not own a property in the last 4 years in which they lived in. So at that point, I could simply enter the date again of when they answered the question, and then I can say that this question is completed. I've got the answer to this question. It is complete. I simply say yes, and now I have completed this question. Now let's have a look at what happens in the tax return when I've completed a question or when the question has been answered by the customer. So I click on the tax return tab, the program will recalculate, and you'll notice another form gets created, which is tax review questions completed. So now we have two forms when it comes to the tax review questions. We have one with the pending questions that our customers have still not answered, which in my example is, did the customer contribute in the first 60 days of 2024? I don't have the answer yet. This remains in the original form, which is essentially the pending questions form. And then for questions that are completed along the way, meaning that for the questions that my customer has answered along the way, I will get a different form, which will log in this case or record the questions that have been answered by the customer. And I see the original question there. I get the answer. I have the answer date, the date of completion, and then finally the notes related to the answer to that question or the explanation in this case. Now, the way I've shown you how to use the tax review checklist is with questions that you pose directly to your clients. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. You can use this tax review checklist as an internal checklist between preparers or between a supervisor and a preparer. So for example, you've got a preparer that prepares the tax return, then the supervisor who checks the return and then simply asks questions on the return to be sent back to the tax preparer. That could be another way of using this tax review checklist. Another aspect of the tax review checklist is its flexibility. You are not bound by the questions that are already preset within the checklist. You can customize it and personalize it to suit your needs. If I go back to my data entry and I go back to the tax review checklist, I can simply grab another one of the keywords. I could go to a general one or maybe a specific one in a specific area of the tax return. And you'll notice that the program will always give you an other option where you can specify the question yourself. So again, this tax review checklist becomes customizable to suit your needs. So we hope you will find this feature useful and use it in your own offices in the upcoming tax season 2023, which is when this keyword group will become active. So let's have a look at the next feature that we mentioned in the introduction, which is the Client Letter Assistant. The Client Letter Assistant is a new feature within DT Max that will allow you to quickly and easily edit the client letter templates within the program. Whereas currently, in order to edit a client letter, you must go through a manual process under the Notepad application where you have to manually input the variables, the conditions, and the mathematical operators. The Client Letter Assistant will offer a word processor-like interface in order to easily edit your client letter templates. This new feature will begin as of 2023 tax year and on. Let's load this new feature. So in order to load the feature, again, starting in the 2023 tax year and on, you simply go to the Tools menu, choose Advanced Utilities, and then select DT Client Letter Assistant. So again, the Tools menu, Advanced Utilities, DT Client Letter Assistant. And here it is, the Client Letter Assistant. Now, in order to get started editing a template, we need to load one of the existing templates that is found within DT Max. So the quickest way to do that is by simply going to the File menu, go to Open Client Letters Templates, and then simply choose one of the existing templates that is offered by DT Max. Now, in my case, I will choose the DT1W Let 2000 and 2023 simply because it is the most complete client letter template that DT Max offers. It's got basically the most variables, it's got the most text that you can play with. So that's the one I'm going to choose. On the left-hand side, we find the various sections that are comprised within the client letter template that was chosen. On the section to the right is where we can actually edit those sections of the client letter. So for example, if I want to edit something in the section of where to sign, so this is where the client letter prompts the client to sign specific forms within their tax return, I simply double click on the section on the left and the program takes me to the actual section within the client letter template that I could edit on the right. What you can also do on the left-hand side is remove sections that you don't want within your version of the client letter template that you are editing. So you can simply untick the boxes to these sections that you deem are not necessary for your template. Now, what you can also do is find specific sections that you're looking for within the client letter by using the search function. So there are two levels of searches that the Client Letter Assistant will offer. One is a very basic search where you could see here the box, the dialog box you see at the top of the screen. For that one, you would have to input specific variable numbers that you're looking for. So you would have to essentially know what the variable numbers are. So for example, if I'm looking for the specific variable 254, and if you're not aware what these variables are, the variables, very simply put, they are amounts that appear on the tax return that you want to trigger a specific paragraph. So for example, if you have a specific amount on a specific line, then if that amount exists on that line, then it'll trigger that paragraph of the client letter. So I simply type in percentage 254, I click on find, and you'll notice here that the Client Letter Assistant will find essentially every single occurrence of percentage 254, which is the specific variable that I'm looking for. Now, again, if you're not aware of what that variable is, the Client Letter Assistant also gives you a clue as to what it is by simply hovering your mouse directly on the variable. And you'll notice here, it'll give you what the variable number is, which is the accountant name in this example. Now, I could also use the advanced search to find the specific areas that I want to edit in the client letter. So when I click on advanced search here at the top taskbar, I can now type in a search item. And here, I'm not just limited, for example, to the variable number. I can go further. I could even enter a term. So for example, let's say I'm looking for anything that mentions interest within the client letter because I want to edit something to mention something about interest income gained during the year. And I want to edit that. I want to change something there. So I simply type in interest within the dialog box here. And then I click on Find Inside the Current File, and you'll notice here a new section will appear in the Client Letter Assistant showing me everywhere where the term interest is being used. And then from here, I could simply double click on those search items. In my case, I had 13 hits. I can simply double click on that search item, and the client letter assistant will take me directly into that area of the client letter that I can now edit. So you see the functionalities of this client letter assistant. You're no longer doing these things manually. You have now a literal assistant here. You have a word processor-like interface to help you in editing this client letter. But we're not done yet. The real magic of the client letter assistant is going to come when we are going to start actually inputting and editing the client letter itself. So let's try that together. So let's close the search function here, or the search results, and let's actually start inputting now a change that I want to make on this client letter template. So in my case, I'm just going to put a very broad example, a very basic example, to show all of you the proof of concept of how the client letter assistant works and how it works really well in editing your client letter in an easy and effective manner. So in my case, I'm going to go just after or around the where to sign section. So I'm going to go to federal non-e-file, which will be just below the where to sign section where I want to input, in this case, my paragraph. And the paragraph that I'm going to put is going to be a very basic paragraph where I want to get into financial planning in this case. So I want to start offering financial planning as a service to my clients. And I notice, for example, that my client has over $10,000 of interest income. That seems pretty tax inefficient to me. I'd like to recommend to my client that they should consider diversifying into dividend income as well, and not just collect interest income as a source of passive income, because of course, the tax efficiency of dividend income. So this is going to be the paragraph that I'm going to add to my client letter template. So I'm going to add the condition in my client letter that the moment my clients got over $10,000 of interest income, I'm going to suggest to them to diversify, in this case, their holdings. So we're going to create some space here within the client letter. So I'm going to go just below here where to sign. And now I have to start entering the coding in order to edit the client letter. So right now I need three things. Right now I need the variable. So in other words, what is the line that the program is going to look for when that line goes above $10,000, which in my example will be interest income on the federal jacket. So that's the variable that I need. The second one will be the condition. So the condition would be if my interest income is above $10,000, then I want to see this paragraph. And then of course I need the math operations. So again, when I put the condition of if, I have to indicate to the client letter that if that $10,000, if that line is above $10,000, then I want to see this paragraph shown. So of course now I have two options here. I can either go into DT Max's knowledge base and go figure out now how to enter the conditions, how to enter the variables, how to enter the mathematical operations, or, and this is the brilliance of the client letter assistant, I could have the assistant enter those three things for me. So let's do that. So number one, I need to find the variable. And on the left-hand menu here, you'll notice that right now I'm under the sections tab, which is, as mentioned before, these were all the sections that I had within the client letter that I could choose. And then I've got a variables tab just to the right. When I click on that, now the program provides me with all of the variables that are found within the client letter, meaning all of the line numbers that are within either the tax return forms or the in-house forms that DT Max produces. So I don't need to look them up. I've got a nice handy menu that'll take me to the variable that I need. So now in my example, I want federal total income because it's interest income that I'm targeting here. And then I've got my variable of percentage 25 interest income. So I can select it here so I have it ready for me on the left. Now, as mentioned, I've got my variable, it's percentage 25, but I need my two other conditions here, which are my condition, number one, and number two, I need the mathematical operator. And of course, I need to enter the paragraph. So what I can do here, and again, the client letter assistant will aid you in doing this by simply right-clicking in the area that I want to see the paragraph in. So when I right-click, now you'll notice I get another interface where it is the client letter assistant that is helping me in adding the 3 things that I need to add in order to have the client letter recognize my paragraph. As I mentioned before, it is the condition, it is the mathematical operator, and it is the variable that I need to have in there. Now, again, I don't need to go to the DT Max knowledge base to gain access to that information. It is the client letter assistant that will get it for me. So I right-click in the area that I want to add my paragraph, and then from here, I will first add my condition. My condition being if my line goes above a certain amount, so if the amount that's on that line number in the tax return goes above that threshold that I want to set, this paragraph will appear in my client letter. So this is what I'll do. I'll choose the condition first. So this is now the programming language, as you can see here, for the client letter to understand what you're looking for. And as you can see, the beauty of it is I don't need to know percentage if, percentage and if. It is the client letter assistant that is handling it for me. Now, once I've done that, I simply go in here. I right-click within the bracket because now I have to first put the variable. So what line number am I specifically looking for for this paragraph? And then I got to put the mathematical operator, meaning greater than $10,000. So in this case, my variable will be my total interest income on the federal jacket, and my mathematical operator will be greater than 0. Again, I don't need to do this offhand or manually. It is the client letter assistant that will help me in doing it. So I right-click within the bracket. I will choose, in this case, my variable, which in my example is interest income. So percentage 25, F12100 interest income. I set it, and then I will add now my mathematical operator, which is greater than 10,000. Because again, I'm venturing into financial planning, and I want to indicate to these clients that, hey, you should consider a more efficient passive income than interest. Maybe you should diversify into dividend income. So I will say greater than, and then I set my floor, which will be $10,000. So from here, you'll see it even guides you. It tells you insert the paragraph here. I take off that generic mention, and now I will mention the paragraph that I want to see within my client letter when I compute this customer's tax return. So in this case, I will simply mention that they should diversify their income, again, away from interest income into something more tax efficient, like dividend income. So I've already set up this paragraph, and I'm just going to copy and paste it here. And there it is. So I will mention to my client, you have over $10,000 of interest income. You should consider diversifying into more tax efficient income, such as dividends, period. And there it is. I've got my edit. Everything is set. So I've got my condition, which is the percentage if, percentage and if. I've got my variable, percentage 25, which is the line number that I'm looking for to trigger this paragraph. And then my condition to trigger the paragraph is that the moment the income is above $10,000, at that point, I want this paragraph to show. So I've got everything ready. As you noticed, it was really simple to do with the client letter assistant, whereas previously I would have had to learn all these conditions, all these variables, all these mathematical operators. With the right-click function, as long as you are in the variables tab here within the left-hand menu, you go and you right-click and then you set all those conditions, variables, and mathematical operators. Is the client letter assistant that is guiding you into adding those paragraphs. So once I am done, I've added my paragraph. Now I will save this new version of the client letter as a separate template that I want to use. So I simply go to the File menu over here. I will go to Save As, and then from here, I will go to a specific folder. In my case, I've got a specific folder, which is DT Client Letter, and then I'll simply, add the mention of interest so that I differentiate this template from the other standard templates that DT Max offers. And once I have renamed that template, I simply click on save. And now this template is ready to be used in my customer's tax return. Before you go into DT Max, you can even preview the client letter that you just edited, the template itself that you have just edited and changed by simply clicking on the Preview Client Letter tab on the right-hand side, right next to the Edit Mode tab. Template within my customer's return, and we have two options in this case on how to apply it. One, we could apply it within the Preferences menu, so it is a template that is being used as your default for all your clients, or you can simply use it purely for one specific client file. Let's have a look at how to do both. This new template as my default client letter for all my clients. And the way I would do that is by simply going to the Preferences menu, by choosing the Client Letter option. So again, Preferences, you go to Client Letter in this case. And once you are in there, notice right now I'm on the default template. I will tell the program, I will point the program to the new letter. I can simply click on the folder icon, and then I can simply grab this new template that I have created now, for all my clients, where I've added that paragraph of interest income. So I click OK, make sure that everything's there. Now let's see if I've got the condition that I was mentioning before. Here it is. I've got $11,000 of interest income. So I've passed the $10,000. Now I will calculate the tax return. And when I calculate the tax return, you will notice now in my client letter, I've got that new paragraph that I was mentioning before that I've added in this case to my template, which is you have over $10,000 of interest income. You should consider diversifying into more tax efficient income such as dividends. So this is some of the financial advice that I'm giving. Of course, I could even add more to it and say, please consult with your financial advisor and my firm in order to help you to diversify your income. Sky's the limit as far as what you can do with this client letter assistant. So that's one way you can edit by using it as the template, in this case, for all your clients. The other way is by adding the letter to the keyword client letter. And by doing it that way, it'll only be applied. This new template that we saved under the client letter assistant, it will only be applied to that specific client. So you're not using it for all the clients in that case. You're still going to be using the default template, but if you want to use this particular template that you just edited with a client letter assistant for this particular client only, you can now use the keyword client letter. So you simply double click in the keyword client letter, a new menu will appear, and you notice here I've got my client letter again, the new template that I've chosen. I can simply choose it within this menu, and now I apply it for that specific client. So we hope you enjoyed what you saw with the client letter assistant. As you can see, it can be a powerful tool in order to help you to edit the client letter as you see fit. You have a lot of powerful features within it, word processor-like features, in order to help you more easily and more effectively edit your client letter. And as I mentioned earlier, this new feature will be available starting for the 2023 tax year. So now let's have a look at some productivity features that we've added recently throughout the last several years. For those of you who are not aware, every single year we do offer what we call the DT Max Update course through the Learning Center portal, which again, you're getting a presentation on during Synergy this year. And within this session, the DT Max Update session, we present a lot of these new improvements to DT Max along the way, on top of presenting tax changes that are coming for the upcoming tax season and how they're reflected in the software. So what we're going to look at now is a summary of some of the recent changes, productivity feature changes that we made to DT Max. So first, we're going to look at the active filter option. And what this is, first of all, it is represented by the filter icon that you see here in DT Max's taskbar in the client list with an A next to it. This is the feature in which you can filter out the inactive clients that are currently, let's not kid ourselves, cluttering your client list. That's essentially what this feature is about. So as you can see within my client list right now, I see example case here that is no longer a client in my example. So in this case, what I'll do is I will activate the active client filter. And what the program will do now is simply hide the inactive clients that are within my client list. That way they're not cluttering your client list. Now, just be aware that the filter is literally just a filter. It means that if the client itself, the inactive client, is not actually removed from your client list. You can always get back to that client if you want to see, or those clients if you want to see them, by simply clicking on the filter icon again, and you'll notice that that inactive client will reappear. Now let's have a look at the user interface of DT Max, where we have several productivity features that are found within it. So to get to the user interface of the program, simply go to the Preferences menu and you choose User Interface. And again, what we find in there is several productivity features from within the program. So Preferences, User Interface. And once we go in there, we're going to look at now several of these features. So number one, we're going to look at the client list itself. And from within this section, you will notice two options that are quite handy. They're quite useful when it comes to the client list and managing your client folders. The first one is to make all columns sortable, meaning that whatever column you add within your client list, when you're personalizing your client list, you could actually sort on that specific column. So over here, I will say make all columns sortable right there. It's giving me a confirmation window. I will click Save, and then I can now sort on any one of these columns. Now, by default, you can sort within DT Max on the client number, on the name, on the birth date, and on the SIN. As you can see, there's a little line right next to those columns, and by default, you can sort based on those columns. But by activating that option in the user preference, in the user interface, you could actually now sort on any one of the columns. So for example, here, I clicked on processing status, and you'll notice that the program now has sorted my client list based on the processing status. So it's grouping up my clients based on the processing status. And processing status, very simply put, what is it? It's simply the progress of the file. So where are you at this file? Is the client ready for e-file? Has the client been transmitted and accepted? Does the client have errors in the data entry? So on and so forth. Now, by sorting here, you can always go back to the default setting of the sorting of the client list, which is basically family groupings, by simply clicking on the family icon within the client list. As you can see here, I've got my mouse hovering over that icon. Simply click on it, and you'll notice again, the program will regroup now and will resort my client list by default to family groupings. Continuing with the user interface, let's go back to the Preferences menu again, and then choose User Interface. We have another option when it comes to the client list. And the other option is to make the families more visible. Now, what does that mean? Well, here, as you notice, in my client list, I've got, my family heads that are in bold, my spouses that are at the same indentation level, and then the dependents that are slightly indented to the right. And then I've got this jagged line to separate between each one of these families. So now, the jagged line, unfortunately, it's not necessarily that clear right now, which is the default setting of the program. But what I can do by saying make families more visible, so I tick the box next to it here, and then I click Save. What you'll notice now is that you clearly see now the delineation between the family groupings. So now you see that it's a straight line instead of a jagged line between the families, and now there's a different color for the family heads versus the other members of the family. So there's a clear demarcation now, again, between the different families and also between the family head and the other members of the family. The family head now is a completely different color than the other family members. I would almost call this classic DT Max. For those of you who have been with us for many years, you know that this was the look of the DT Max client list back in the day. We made a change to the look of the client list several years ago. Well, now you could go back to the classic view of DT Max by simply activating that option. Now, the user interface doesn't just give productivity features for purely the client list. It actually gives productivity features for all the screens that you use in DT Max, which of course we know are the 3 screens that are represented by the tabs here at the top left of the screen. So if I go back here to the preferences menu, and again, I go to the user interface, in this case, I will go now to the data entry section. And there's one interesting productivity feature here, which is to differentiate the family members by using different colors. So this is not a default of the program. You actually have to tick that box and activate it. I currently have it activated, but you would have to activate this at the beginning of the tax season. When you tick that box here, now what you will have, and then of course you click save at the bottom, what you will get in DT Max is different colors of the data entry for the different types of family members that we have. So for example, here my family head, who is male, will be in blue. Meanwhile, when I go to the spouse, who is female, they will be in pink in this case, or let's say, lighter red in this case. And finally, the dependents will be represented in green. So you see now a clear delineation between the family members. That way you don't mistake a data entry that is meant for another family member within the family member you're producing right now. So it's a great feature. It's a nice way of delineating between the family members. That way you're avoiding mistakes of data entry. So since we are in the data entry, let's have a look at a great productivity feature of the data entry, which are the tags, tagging keywords and adding notes to keywords as well. So if I scroll down here, for example, and I look at the T4 slip that I've entered for this client, what I can do as I'm verifying the return is I can right click on any one of these fields and tag the keywords directly. Now, the basic one is what we call the tag keyword checked OK. And by doing that, you simply add a check mark next to the field, and you've essentially indicated that you've checked that amount. Now, what you also have as a tag is a question mark, meaning that you're not sure, maybe you're not sure about the entry, or maybe you feel it's erroneous and you need to check that. What you can do is, again, you go to the field, right click on the field, and then you choose the option tag keyword for review. So by putting that, now you'll add a question mark with an exclamation mark next to the field, prompting you to go back to this field and to check it. But not only that, the program will add that tag to your diagnostics as well. So when I click on the diagnostic icon of DT Max, which is the yellow triangle with the exclamation mark, you'll notice that the tag that I've added for review gets added to my error and warning messages into my diagnostics. So I'll have a list here of all the fields that I've tagged for review, and then I can simply double click and the program will take me directly to that field that I need to review. Now, these tags can also affect certain diagnostics directly in the data entry. So for example, over here, when I've entered my EI premiums and my QPP contributions, for example, you'll notice here, when I click again on the diagnostics, that the program disagrees with the amounts that are entered. They should be different amounts based on the government calculations. You see here EI premiums and even the dividend one as well. So let's say EI premiums over here. So the tags, when it comes to the T4 slip, can also remove these diagnostics. So let's say, for example, you know what, the amount is erroneous, but that's what's on the T4. I can't change it. This is what the employer deducted as EI premiums. Therefore, there's nothing I can do. I can remove this tag by simply, that diagnostic, by simply right-clicking on the field and then checking tag keyword checked OK by putting essentially a tick mark next to it. Now, for those of you who like shortcut keys, it is the equal key for the check mark, and for the review, it's a question mark. Okay, use the question mark key on your keyboard. So in this case, let me now remove that diagnostic by simply saying tag keyword checked OK, and now notice that the program will add the tick mark next to the field, and then when I go to my diagnostics, you'll notice that my EI diagnostic is gone. Okay, I no longer have it. I've told the program, look, I verified the T4. I understand the calculation is wrong, but you know what? This is what the employer deducted. Nothing I could do. So at that point, the program will remove that diagnostic. Now, the only place where DT Max will do this within the T1 is directly in the T4 slip when it comes to the contribution. So we're talking CPP contributions, QPP contributions for those of you who are in Quebec, EI contributions, and QPIP contributions for those of you who are in Quebec. So now let's go to the tax return and let's have a look at another feature, productivity feature within the tax return, which is the review tags as well. So we saw review tags in the data entry. Just be aware that we also have them on the tax return. And on the tax return, they're much more elaborate. You can actually do a lot more things within the tax return. So from here, let's say, for example, I've got my $2,050 of taxable dividends. You know, I could also drill down. I could double check by simply double clicking on the field. The program takes me to the source form. You know what? I notice, man, I don't think this is correct. So at this point, I double check it. It's not correct. I want to now flag this field for an error. Okay, and now what I could do is I could simply right click on the field, and you'll notice here that we've got tags as well. Okay, so we got tags here that you could tag the field for review, just like we saw in the data entry. You could tag it as an error. You could tag it as checked okay, again, similar to the data entry. And you could also put a final check to it as well. What you can also do is add notes directly to the fields on the tax return screen as well. And this is not just limited to the government forms. You can put them on any single form that DT Max will produce that has a field, that has an amount essentially. Now, let me answer a question right away that we get a lot when it comes to these review tags. Any notes you put in there, any tags you put in will not be transmitted to the CRA and to Revenue Quebec for those of you who are in Quebec. Okay, there's no need to fear. There's no need to worry. You could put any note you like and nothing will be transmitted to the CRA and to Revenue Quebec. So in this case, let's just put a basic tag of an error. So then here I simply choose error, and you'll notice now that the program will highlight that field red to tell me that there is an error. And within my list of forms on the left, it also tagged that page of the forms with one of those tags. It's essentially telling me, hey, I've got an error on that form. Now, what I could also do is add a review note to that field. So for example, I can right click again on the field, and I could say add review notes. So for example, let's say I'm the checker in this case, okay, and I want to tell the preparer, hey, I checked this is wrong, and I want to put a note for the preparer. I simply right click as I just did there, and then I say add a review note. And then once I do that, I get now a new window where I could add notes to that review tag. So first, I could actually choose the type of review tag that I want to select. In my case, it'll be an error. And then I could simply type in my note. So at this point, I could simply tell the preparer, in this case, erroneous entry, please correct. So then once I've indicated my note, I save it. You'll notice now a little tab appears at the top of the field. And then when I go to that tab, you will see the review note. And there it is. And there's my note. I simply hover with my mouse and I get my note. Now, what DT Max will also do is give you a list of the review tags that you've added within the tax return. So all you have to do is simply right click on any one of these fields, doesn't matter which one, and then you can ask the program to list for you all of the review tags. So once I click on that, you'll see now a list of all those review tags, including the notes that were added within those review tags. And then of course, you could also double click on that tag and it'll take you directly to the field that you tagged. We hope you enjoyed this segment of the DT Max session, which were some of the recent productivity features that we added to the program. Now what we're going to look at is a preview of a course that we give within the Tax and Accounting Learning Center. So welcome to the preview of the Tax and Accounting Learning Center, where we offer various special topic courses on DT Max, including, as I mentioned earlier, DT Max Update, where we give a tax update and a software update. And then we also give some special topic courses. For example, the one I'm going to give you a preview of this one, which will be non-resident, part-year resident, and deemed resident. And then from there, we also give a session on capital gains, on business income, rental income, foreign income, so on and so forth. So for all these sessions, what we do is that we go through the tax theory and then we look at the practical aspect of it, meaning how do I apply these tax rules into DT Max? So what I'm going to do here in this session is give you a preview of the non-resident, part-year resident, deemed resident session that we ordinarily give in the Tax and Accounting Learning Center. Hopefully you'll see something that you will like, and you'll register for these courses during the tax season. We offer these courses between mid-January and mid-March. So let's start. Let's have a look here at the non-resident, part-year resident. So this will be the agenda. What we're going to do is we're going to look at determining residency and non-residence, and only one part of non-residence. We're going to look at non-residence subject to Part 1 tax. I'll cut the preview there. And then if you want to take the session so you could see the rest of these topics within this session, you simply register for the sessions during the winter, which will be between January and mid-March. So first, we're going to look at determining residency. So how do we determine whether an individual is a resident of Canada or not? So the first key here for the Government of Canada is what they consider as significant residential ties, meaning that your customer has significant ties to Canada. And what the government considers as significant residential ties, which really will hold the balance here, will be a dwelling place, the residency of the spouse or common law partner, and dependents. So in other words, these are the main factors that will determine whether the individual is a resident of Canada or not. So, the joke that I always say within these sessions is that the Income Tax Act, defies the laws of physics. And the reason why I mention that is because you could have an individual that is currently not physically in the country, not physically in Canada, but still considered a resident of Canada. So now, again, the significant residential ties in this case would be the dwelling place. Where is this individual's permanent home? And then where does the spouse and where do the dependents live? This will be what the government considers significant residential ties, which will tip the balance on residency. So for example, you could have an individual that takes a work contract in Europe, is now going to be living in Europe and working in Europe for 2 years, let's say, will not be physically in Canada. However, their permanent home, their spouse, and their dependents are still in Canada. So in that example, the significant residential ties will tip the scale and will still consider this individual as a resident of Canada, even though physically that person is not in Canada. So this will be, one of the measures that the government takes. Now, if the significant residential ties doesn't tip the balance, if we can't really tip the scale here as far as the person being resident of Canada, then we go into the secondary residential ties to figure out whether this individual is a resident or not. So some of the secondary residential ties are personal property in Canada, social ties within Canada, hospitalization and medical insurance coverage, a driver's license in the province in Canada, a registered vehicle in Canada, where are their personal belongings, that was the personal property, so on and so forth. They have a Canadian passport, etc. So these are what the government considers secondary ties. Now, not one of these will usually tip the scale. It'll usually be a combination of the secondary residential ties that will tip the scale and determine that this individual will be a resident of Canada. So you, as a taxpayer, when you receive one of these clients where you're not exactly sure whether they're resident or not, the first job you must do is to determine the residency. You must determine factually whether this individual is a resident of Canada for tax purposes or not. So you start with a significant residential ties. If that won't tip the scale, then you have to go to the residential ties. And the residential ties, the secondary, residential ties, and that will determine whether this individual will be a Canadian resident or not. And remember that secondary residential ties is usually by cumulative. It is not one that will tip the scale. You have to go on a cumulative basis through all these factors and see whether they are a resident of Canada. So now let's assume that you've done this exercise, you've determined concretely that the customer is a non-resident of Canada. Now, how do we tax this individual? Because the reason why this individual has come to you is likely they've gained some sort of Canadian sourced income in Canada. Therefore, now we must determine in this case, how do we tax this individual even though they're a non-resident of Canada? So the first thing is we must determine at least what I call the type of non-resident that you have. Okay, there are two categories. There are two categories of non-residents. You have non-residents that are subject to Part 1 tax, just like any other resident of Canada. And then you have non-residents that are subject to Part 13 tax, which is commonly referred to as the non-resident tax. Now, how do we categorize as non-residents? So you have a non-resident in front of you. He or she has gained income in Canada. Is this income taxed in Canada, even though this individual is a non-resident? We have to now fit them into one of these two categories. So how do we distinguish now which category your customer falls into? The way you distinguish it is with the type of income that this individual has gained. And you already have the clue here already in the PowerPoint where it tells you the two types here, where it tells you what type of income. Let's start with the non-residents subject to Part 1 tax. So how do we determine that this non-resident is subject to Part 1 tax, meaning he or she is subject to the same tax as any other resident of Canada, even though they're considered non-residents according to the Act? Well, in this case, it is the type of income that will determine it. So what type of income categorizes this individual as a non-resident subject to Part 1 tax? It is employment income, gained in Canada, of course, self-employment income gained in Canada, and or disposition of a taxable Canadian property. So it's either one of these income types or a combination of the three that will, again, the lack of a better term, tip the scale and essentially categorize this individual as a non-resident subject to Part 1 tax. Now, what is a taxable Canadian property? Ordinarily with a session, I would remit a document that will give all the details as far as taxable Canadian property. Just to summarize what it is, you are essentially talking about real estate property that is owned in Canada or any shares in a private corporation that is a Canadian corporation. Okay, so any disposition of that type of property becomes a disposition of a Canadian taxable property, a taxable Canadian property, and these non-residents would be subject to Part 1 tax. Now, just like I mentioned before, Part 1 tax is the same tax that any other resident of Canada would pay. So in this case, because of this, these individuals would be subject to provincial tax as well. Okay, so there would be no surtax for these individuals. They would actually be subject to provincial tax. And if this individual, for example, gained their income in Quebec, this type of income in Quebec, then they would have to file a Quebec tax return as well. If it's for the rest of Canada, they would have to file their 428 forms and pay the provincial tax on that income. So now let's have a look at how we indicate a non-resident subject to Part 1 tax in DT Max. So now we're in DT Max, and we're going to look at how we process an individual who is a non-resident and subject to Part 1 tax. So step number 1, I go to the keyword prov residence, and I choose the province where the income was gained. And remember, it's the three types of income: employment income, self-employment income, or disposition of a taxable Canadian property. So we must indicate in this case the province that this income was gained. Okay, so let's say in my example, I'll choose Quebec just to show just to get to the second return. Okay, but just be aware you would be choosing the province that the income was gained. Now, so far, I still haven't indicated to the software that the client is a non-resident. Okay, right now, so far, all the program knows is that this customer is a resident of Quebec. I must now specify that the client is a non-resident. So I go to the keyword non-resident, and then I choose the option non-resident. Once I choose that option, I get to worldwide income. And within worldwide income, I must indicate now the income that was gained by the customer outside of Canada during the year. The reason for this is, of course, for what's commonly referred to as the 90% rule, meaning that if all or almost all of the income gained by the individual during the year is Canadian sourced, then they are entitled to their full non-refundable tax credits like any other resident of Canada. And of course, the big one is the basic personal amount. So for a non-resident, it's an all or nothing proposition. Either they're entitled to the full basic personal amount, meaning they meet the 90% rule, or they're entitled to nothing of the basic personal amount. They get nothing of it, meaning they don't meet the 90% rule. So in order for the program to determine this, I must specify the foreign sourced income. Now, the customer is not getting taxed on the foreign sourced income. All we're doing in this keyword is to specify the income for the purposes of the 90% rule calculation. Now, ordinarily, when I'm giving this session, I would explain this rule before I get into DT Max, but due to time constraints, I'm just explaining it now while I'm in DT Max. So I go into foreign sourced income, and then I choose the amount and I plug in whatever amount they gained in or outside of Canada. In this case, actually, it would be outside of Canada. So now I've indicated to the program that it's a non-resident, and I've indicated their foreign sourced income for the purposes of determining the 90% rule. Now, the last step, I declare the customer's income in Canada. So I will go ahead and add a T4 slip. Here it is. And now I will plug in the amounts. So, just to make this brief, I'm not going to, enter every single amount in there. I'm just going to enter a tax withheld at source. Let's say here. And that's it. I'm good to go now. Okay, so now I've inputted the income. It is an income that categorizes this client as a non-resident subject to Part 1 tax. Remember that this client is subject to provincial tax, which means that in this case, this client would be producing a Quebec return in this example. If this is the rest of Canada, you would be getting a 428 form for this client. So let's just make sure that I choose Quebec as well for the province of employment in box 10. And now I will compute the tax return. And here we are. The program has computed the return. And as you can see here, the program is indicating that it is, in this case, a non-resident subject to Part 1. I scroll down. There's the income. Everything is there. But then I get the special forms that I require for this return, which again, I'm doing this briefly, but ordinarily they would have been explained before getting into DT Max. I get to Schedule A, which would be, in this case, the statement of worldwide income. So I'm declaring basically the income from Canadian sources, the income from foreign sources, and then finally on Schedule B, I'm getting the calculation of the 90% rule, which in this case I don't meet. I'm only at 88% in this case, which means that when I go to my non-refundable tax credits, you'll notice that I don't get the basic personal amount. So the program is applying the rule for 90%, but of course, I fed the program the information in order for it to compute the 90% rule in this scenario. So we hope you enjoyed this session. We hope it gave you quite a few tidbits on DT Max, on how to use DT Max, including the new features that I showed you earlier in the session. Hopefully you will be able to put them to good use. Hopefully you like what you saw as well here with the preview of the Learning Center. Again, there is another session given about the Learning Center, which will explain how the Learning Center works. If you're interested in taking this type of course, again, like I said, we've got about 7 or 8 of these special topic courses that are based on tax topics and how they're applied in the software. All you have to do is simply sign up to the Tax and Accounting Learning Center, which we will, you can ask one of our agents who will show you how to do it. So we hope you enjoyed it again, and enjoy the rest of Synergy 2023. Thank you for watching.